this weekly reading, the Parsha, what we call, is called by the first word of this reading, Vayera. Now, it's known that it's mostly common among the Jewish people to call every weekly reading, every Parsha, according to the first word of it, or sometimes if it's not the first, it's the second or third word. If the first word of the Parsha is too common, like Vayidaber, right? If the Parsha starts, let's say the first verse of a Parsha is that Hashem spoke to Moshe, there are just so many psukim like that it kind of makes no sense to call the Parsha that way. So, for instance, Parsha Tazria, it is not called by the word Vayidaber, which is the first verse. It's called by the first word in the second verse. Not even the first word, actually. It's the third word, Ishaki Tazria. The full name of the Parsha would be Ishaki Tazria, if a woman gets pregnant. But the actual word chosen, which is a less common word, right? The word woman is also very common, so therefore we use the third word in a second verse in that Parsha. So there are some exclusions, but the idea is we choose one of the lesser common known words that is in the beginning of the Parsha. And even the whole books of Torah, the whole books of Tanakh, are usually called by the word in the beginning of the book. So, for instance, the first book is called Bereshit, the second is Shemot. So one would assume, therefore, that the names that usually non-Jews call the various books of Torah are completely not part of our tradition, right? Since we usually call, for instance, the third book of Moshe is called Vayikra, and he called, and the non-Jews call it Leviticus. So one might assume that Leviticus is a completely non-Jewish name. The answer is it's not true. We know for sure 100% from the Talmudic tradition that there was an alternative way to call the various books, and many of them fit exactly the way they were later translated into Latin and other biblical translations, and that's how the non-Jews today call these books, meaning it was an alternative way. The Jews had two different ways of how to call various books. Take, for instance, the book that we read on Tisha B'Av, on the 9th of Av, the saddest day of our year. It's called Kinot as an alternative name. One of the names of the book is Eicha. Eicha is the first word in that book, but it's also called Kinot by our sages, and that's exactly what lamentation means in English. Lamentations is Kinot. Similarly, the book of Vayikra, the alternative name was Torat Kohanim, the Torah of Kohanim, of Kohens, and obviously Leviticus comes from that. Sometimes the Torah calls the Leviim Kohanim. It's not really exactly the same group, but Kohanim is a subset of Leviim. But at any rate, the word Leviticus absolutely comes from the idea of Torat Kohanim. The fourth book of Torah is called Chumash HaPekudei. The Chumash is one of the five books. So the one of the five books that's doing Pekudim is some kind of census. So numbers in English comes from the word census, Pekudim. And at last, the last book of Moshe is called Torah. Is called Mishnah Torah, the repetition of the Torah, and that's of course where the word Deuteronomy comes from. So we know for sure, as I mentioned just now, at least in the case of three books of Moshe and one book of Yirmiyahu, it's considered that the author is Yirmiyahu. It doesn't say really in the book itself, Lamentations, right? We see that there are clear parallels between the way the non-Jews call this book and the way our sages also called it. It's just a more common way for us to call various parshiyot and various books is by one of the first names, for one of the first words in that book. But that doesn't mean that the alternative naming system didn't exist. It existed, but it was less used, just like today. We rarely call the book of, let's say, the book of Vayikra, we rarely call it Torat Kohanim. But it is an alternative name. Leviticus is the alternative name. So the reason I digressed a little bit is because and by the way, in the cases where we can't prove it for sure, we don't have Chazal calling the first book, the Chumash, Genesis, but maybe Breshit actually means something similar. Breshit means in the beginning. We don't find Mifurash that Chazal used the book of Exodus, any kind of term like that, but Ramban uses it as a similar term, the book of Geula, the book of redemption, he calls it. So Exodus and redemption are somewhat synonymous in this context. So at any rate, even in the case we don't have a proof, but since so many books had an alternative name, how our sages called it, and it parallels the name that ultimately the non-Jews called it. So probably the other books also had an alternative name. We just don't necessarily have a proof from the times of Chazal, from a Mishnah, or from the Talmud that they had that name, but most likely it did. But coming back to the parshiyot, to the weekly readings, so the reason I started digressing into this direction is because there is a different parsha that's very similar. It's not similar at all to the parsha itself, but very similar by its name, because we usually choose one of the first words in the parsha. So there is Parsha Vayera. It's the second parsha of the book of Shemot, and there is Parsha Vayera. It's the same word but in a different form. Vaera means he appeared, and Vaera is in the first person. I appeared. That's all. So not to be confused when you see Parshat Vayera, Vaera. At any rate, what I wanted to mention here is that this Parsha Vayera happens to be read on 2 days of Rosh Hashana. And that's a very interesting phenomenon for a few reasons. First of all, the decision of which Parsha to read on which holiday was made already in the times of Chazal, of course. It's mentioned in the Masechet Megillah, in the tractate Megillah at the end, which weekly reading should we read on which holiday. And on most holidays, the weekly reading, not weekly reading, the reading, the part of the Torah that we read, the passage that we read. In most cases, it's clearly parallel to the holiday. For example, a lot of the parshiyot, a lot of the passages that we read for the holidays are the same on various holidays. If they mention, for instance, Pesach, Shavuot, Sukkot, they might be read on all of these occasions. For example, in the last day of Pesach, the last day of Shavuot, and the pre-last day of Sukkot, meaning Shmini Atzeret, we read the passage from Parshat Vayera, because it mentions all three holidays. At least the parallel is clear. But with regards to Rosh Hashana, there was an original opinion to read actually the Parsha that deals with Rosh Hashana itself. There is such an opinion mentioned. But in the end, the Talmud says that no, we don't do that, and we read the two parshiyot from Sefer Breshit. I'm wondering if some of it has to do with the fact that when Rosh Hashanah was observed as one day, it made sense to read only about Rosh Hashanah. But when it became a 2-day holiday, and even in Israel, the Jews celebrate Rosh Hashanah, it's the only Yom Tov that's celebrated 2 days even in Israel, because it falls on the first day of the month. So as opposed to other holidays where only on the southern land of Israel, where the witnesses who knew that when the new moon was seen, when the first day of the month is, they would arrive too late. So far from Israel, people would observe 2 days of the holidays because we didn't know then which day would be the true holiday. And only later, when the calendar was fixed, we know for sure which day is the holiday, but we still observe 2 days outside the land of Israel. But with Rosh Hashanah, it's the first day of the month. The witnesses may come anytime. Maybe they'll see the moon, maybe they won't. So the first day is observed, and then if the witnesses come very close to the end of the day, the second day is observed too. I simplified a little bit. It's more complex. There's a sugya in both tractate Rosh Hashanah and Beitza that discusses all this in detail. But at any rate, even in Israel, Rosh Hashanah is observed 2 days. And notice how 2 passages were taken one after another, both from our parsha, our weekly reading. So first it talks about the birth of Yitzchak, and it says that Sarah was nifkeda, was kind of visited. Hashem made her decision of that she would give birth on Rosh Hashana. But even more so, it says that when Yishmael was in danger, Hashem answered him b'asher hu sham, at the place where he was, meaning that Yishmael at that time, as our sages say, was righteous, and that's why Hashem saved him. That we want on Rosh Hashanah to emphasize that Hashem doesn't look at what will happen to the person later. Maybe he'll sin later, but at this point he's righteous. So it's a very good passage to read on Rosh Hashanah. And immediately afterwards is the passage of Akeda, which is read on the second day of Rosh Hashanah. So it's the only holiday where we read 2 passages in a row on the 2 days in a row. Maybe it has to do with the idea that on Rosh Hashanah, the 2 days are considered all one big holiday. There are actually specific consequences of this in Halakha. I'm not going to go into this right now, but in some senses, 2 days of Rosh Hashanah are all one big holiday, as opposed to 2 days of Pesach or Shavuot. Those holidays, each day is considered, maybe it's Yom Tov, maybe it's weekday. But only one of them is a real holiday. We behave as if we don't know. Like our ancestors who lived far from Israel did not know which day is the holiday. But in Rosh Hashanah, sometimes both days are a holiday. And that's why maybe they chose 2 parshiyot that follow each other. And like I said, these parshiyot don't have a direct relation. It doesn't talk about the actual holiday. The Yom HaZikaron, how Torah calls it, the Day of Remembrance. It talks about other things, but it has to do with it. We're trying to arouse divine, make Hashem merciful to us, kind of, and that's why we read these specific passages. So we end up reading part of our Parsha twice a year, on the 2 days of Rosh Hashanah. And if you like this video, please press like.